Bene, buongiorno a tutti. Oggi è il 25 marzo 2023. Io sono Bruno Crevato-Selvaggi, presidente della Federazione fra le Società Filateliche Italiane. Do il benvenuto a tutti. Questo è un seminario per giurati ed espositori nella classe competitiva di filatelia tradizionale. La Federazione organizza da tempo dei seminari specializzati per gli espositori delle varie classi e siccome oggi lo facciamo tramite il delegato nazionale, giurati esperti e il delegato nazionale alle mostre e raggiurie. Quindi Luca Lavagnino, Aniello Veneri ed altri che ringrazio per la partecipazione e per l'impegno nell'organizzazione di questo seminario. Ci fa particolarmente piacere avere anche degli ospiti internazionali come uditori, ma abbiamo anche un co-relatore nel seminario. Noi come federazione crediamo molto nella partecipazione internazionale, nello scambio internazionale di esperienze, perché solamente confrontandoci con altri paesi riusciamo a ottenere i migliori risultati. Oggi con noi è Charles Verge, che viene dal Canada, è un giurato internazionale di filatelia tradizionale e non solo di filatelia tradizionale, è una importante figura del mondo filatelico internazionale. Charles, I thank you for your participation in our seminar of traditional philately. I'm sure your knowledge and your didactics matters will be really useful for our participants. E Charles terrà la sua presentazione in lingua inglese, ma per qualcuno di voi che vuole porgli delle domande e magari non è così fluente in inglese, vi ricordo che Charles parla perfettamente anche francese, viene da quella regione canadese il Quebec, dove si è bilingui, quindi potete anche dopo porgli delle domande in francese se lo preferite. Lascio a Luca, ringrazio tutti della partecipazione e ascolterò con attenzione questo seminario. Prego.
Grazie Bruno, mi associo ai ringraziamenti nei confronti dei relatori, Aniello come delegato nazionale per la filatelia tradizionale e delegato presso la commissione FIP dell'omonima classe, e naturalmente a Charles Verge che nell'ultimo mese ha avuto modo di collaborare con me e con Aniello strettamente nella preparazione del seminario, e quindi lo ringrazio caldamente. Thank you Charles for your work, cooperation and especially your time. We will appreciate for sure your contribution today towards the exhibiting traditional philately. Il seminario sarà aperto dall'intervento di Aniello, a seguire ci sarà quello di Charles e infine naturalmente lo spazio per le vostre domande e risposte che potranno eventualmente essere poste nella chat che è disponibile su Zoom, e poi alla fine appunto dell'intervento di Charles porremo le domande ai relatori a seconda della tipologia di argomento. Grazie a tutti, lascio la parola ad Aniello.
Grazie Luca per l'intro, grazie Presidente per l'opportunità concessa di tenere questo seminario di filatelia tradizionale. Il mio in realtà sarà un breve intervento introduttivo, diciamo la parte più sostanziosa sarà quella di Charles, però ci tenevo in qualche modo a fare un po' il punto della situazione su quello che è la situazione attuale in Italia della filatelia tradizionale. Qui vi riporto diciamo, uno schema di sintesi di quelle che sono state le collezioni esposte nella classe filatelia tradizionale per le esposizioni che si sono tenute dal 2017 al 2022. Qui una tabella di sintesi dove leggete il nome dell'esposizione, l'anno e il numero delle collezioni che sono state presentate con i relativi livelli di medaglia. Il totale delle collezioni, come potete vedere, è 38, sostanzialmente tutte di ottimo livello, perché come potete vedere vi è una più o meno uguale distribuzione dei risultati tra oro grande, oro e vermeil grande. Devo dire diciamo, per trasparenza che alcune collezioni si sono ripetute nel corso delle varie esposizioni, però sostanzialmente circa 28-30 collezioni diverse sono state presentate. È un numero, come dire, contenuto, ma non troppo. Tendenzialmente la filatelia tradizionale è, come dire, la prima forma di collezione a cui tendenzialmente un collezionista approda, no? In genere il passaggio alla storia postale è successivo. C'è da dire che sicuramente è un numero che può essere migliorato. Io qui ho provato a buttare giù alcune come dire, idee per aumentare questo numero di collezioni. In Italia da alcuni anni a questa parte abbiamo come dire, una tradizione pressoché tutta italiana di collezionare determinate serie, anzi delle singole serie, impostando la collezione però da un punto di vista storico-postale. Mi sento di dire che queste sono collezioni di storia postale a metà, non so, immagino collezioni del tipo usi postali della serie Floreale piuttosto che dell'avvento della Repubblica o magari della Michelangiolesca. Banalmente queste collezioni, se sviluppate anche nella parte più propriamente di filatelia tradizionale, quindi con un occhio a quelle che sono in qualche modo le varietà, le specializzazioni, la genesi della serie, lì dove sono presenti prove e saggi, capite bene che sono collezioni che possono essere tranquillamente presentate anche nella sezione di filatelia tradizionale. Quindi dal mio punto di vista tutti quei collezionisti che in qualche modo hanno approcciato collezioni di storia postale su determinate serie che quindi in qualche modo hanno più a che vedere con i concetti tipici della filatelia tradizionale piuttosto che della storia postale, potrebbero divertirsi cimentandosi nell'ampliare la collezione e in qualche modo sdoppiando la partecipazione nelle due diverse tipologie. C'è da dire che dal mio punto di vista, per la mia esperienza, c'è anche da sfatare in qualche modo alcuni falsi miti, no? Tendenzialmente le collezioni di filatelia tradizionale fanno un po' paura, diciamo escluso se vogliamo la parte degli antichi stati, per la complessità del materiale da in qualche modo reperire e quindi esporre, e dall'idea, il falso mito che ho in mente è che bisogna avere tutto. Secondo me non è così tendenzialmente, perché per quanto riguarda le varietà, una dentellatura spostata, immaginando una serie ordinaria, non è che bisogna averla per tutti i 20 valori che compongono la serie ordinaria o volendo anche le serie commemorative, così come le differenti, non lo so, gomme piuttosto che filigrane, piuttosto che varietà di stampa. Probabilmente sarebbe opportuno focalizzare quelle che sono le 5, 6, 7 varietà di stampa, non lo so, mi immagino una stampa incompleta, una doppia stampa, una stampa evanescente, e se si ha la possibilità di proporre 2 o 3 francobolli diversi, ben venga, ma non mi aspetto di vedere la dentellatura spostata su tutti i 20 valori della serie. Quindi probabilmente anche un'idea di semplificazione, ponendo l'attenzione più diciamo, a cosa si vuole illustrare che su tutti i francobolli della serie. Dal mio punto di vista questo potrebbe in qualche modo alleggerire il discorso. Un altro input che mi sento di dare è quello di provare a ragionare su argomenti trasversali. Noto sempre, come dire, con una certa frequenza una particolare focalizzazione su serie. Perché non immaginare di sviluppare collezioni, e in questo la filatelia tradizionale offre ampie possibilità, su tecniche di stampa, piuttosto che macchine che hanno prodotto i francobolli, su sistemi di dentellature, non lo so, su tutta una serie di produzioni che magari in Italia abbiamo avuto presso un istituto piuttosto che un altro, o a partire dal poligrafico nel 29. Quindi voglio dire, immaginare di sfruttare tipologie che sono tipiche delle tecniche di stampa, o addirittura delle tipologie di filigrana, o perché no addirittura dei disegnatori. Probabilmente se qualcuno sviluppasse una collezione di filatelia tradizionale su Corrado Mezzana, nessuno avrebbe nulla in contrario, sarebbe una bellissima collezione di filatelia tradizionale, e per di più completamente nuova. Non credo di aver visto mai una collezione di filatelia tradizionale impostata su un disegnatore, un bozzettista, piuttosto che una tecnica di stampa. Quindi in qualche modo la filatelia tradizionale in questo ci consente delle ampie possibilità che, se confrontiamo con le altre tipologie di collezioni, non lo so, storia postale probabilmente ne abbiamo viste di tutti i colori. In filatelia tradizionale mi sento di dire che ci sono delle numerose possibilità che ancora ad oggi non sono state ampiamente colte. E in quest'ottica va anche il quarto punto: ampliare gli orizzonti. Non è detto che dobbiamo per forza proporre collezioni italiane. Banalmente, anche guardando al nostro interno, non ricordo personalmente con le collezioni di filateria tradizionale di Vaticano e San Marino, che tendenzialmente per gran parte del tempo quei francobolli sono stati prodotti con le stesse macchine che hanno prodotto i francobolli italiani, per cui argomenti trasversali: perché non accostare francobolli italiani a francobolli del Vaticano e di San Marino per, come dicevo prima, spiegare, illustrare tecniche di stampa, nuove filigrane. Ricordo ad esempio le classiche filigrane di San Marino e Vaticano, con tutta una serie di posizioni che ancora ad oggi non sono state scoperte, che offrono sicuramente delle possibilità notevoli. Oppure perché non rivolgere l'attenzione a ovviamente altri stati europei o meno, che magari in Italia sono meno collezionati, quindi meno conosciuti, e perché no potrebbe essere l'occasione per far vedere tutta una serie di francobolli o di collezioni diverse, anche perché poi non è necessariamente detto che i francobolli degli altri paesi possano, o meglio, debbano costare di più dei francobolli italiani. Questo sinceramente non lo so, ma magari con possibilità molto più diciamo alla portata di tutti, non escluso che si possa mettere insieme una collezione di quel tale paese in 60 fogli, magari con una facilità di reperimento del materiale più facile rispetto ai francobolli italiani. Da ultimo, la filateria tradizionale, e su questo credo che nessuno abbia come dire, da controbattere, è quella che ancora ad oggi, e ve lo dico io che colleziono francobolli ordinari, offre delle possibilità di scoprire posizioni di filigrana, piuttosto che dentellatura, piuttosto che usi postali, infinitamente maggiori rispetto a tutti gli altri settori. Non è escluso che si possano trovare come dire, lettere importanti per destinazioni estere sconosciute, e quindi sono aspetti tipici della storia postale. Però ancora oggi a me capita che avendo delle informazioni un pochettino più di nicchia rispetto a tutta una serie di collezionisti che magari preferiscono altri aspetti, riesco a trovare dei pezzi anche, come dire, tendenzialmente importanti che vanno ad arricchire le collezioni. Per cui da questo punto di vista la filateria tradizionale offre delle possibilità incredibili. E per concludere mi sento di dire che poiché nello stesso tempo negli ultimi sicuramente 10-20 anni sono state fatte delle scoperte numerose a vari livelli, questo implicitamente ha fatto anche diminuire il costo, se vogliamo, di determinati francobolli, per cui alcune rarità che negli anni 80-90 venivano battute all'asta a diverse decine di migliaia di euro, oggi purtroppo per fortuna magari con qualche migliaio di euro si possono comprare, per cui anche, come dire, la possibilità di accesso a materiale tendenzialmente raro che prima era preclusa o per il prezzo o perché oggettivamente il numero di oggetti in circolazione era estremamente contenuto, oggi una serie di elementi hanno consentito sicuramente una maggior facilità di poter prima o poi entrare in possesso di questi pezzi. E pertanto mi sento di dire che forse nei confronti della filatelia tradizionale, e qui concludo, c'è un, chiamiamolo pregiudizio, una forse difetto di comunicazione da parte dei soggetti interessati che andrebbe in qualche modo eliminato, ridotto, per far sì che in qualche modo le collezioni di filatelia tradizionale possano aumentare sia a concorso che, come dire, a livello strettamente personale nel corso dei prossimi anni. Io qui concludo il mio breve intervento che, come vi dicevo, era solo introduttivo, lasciando la parola a Charles che avrà un ben più duro compito e sono curioso di ascoltarlo. Grazie.
Charles,
Yes.
the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you.
Ok.
Yep. Buongiorno signore e signori, ringrazio la Federazione Filateliche Italiana, Bruno, Luca e Aniello per avermi invitato a questo convegno. And that's my Italian for today. I am an international traditional postal history, youth, and philatelic literature judge. I was part of the bureau, traditional bureau from 2000 and 2016 to 2022. And during that time, the Bureau and the Commission prepared new guidelines for traditional philately and how to judge them at the international level. Next slide, please. The guidelines were approved at the 76th Fifth Congress in Jakarta on the 8th of August, 2022. I recommend strongly that you view and consult the new guidelines on the FIP website. This presentation was prepared keeping these guidelines in mind. I warn you, like everything else at the international world, the implementation takes time. Current judges are not trained on the new guidelines. There are infrequent assignments of the judges. Exhibitors are not following the new guidelines, etc. It means that you will not necessarily have a judging panel that will be up to date at the international level or maybe even at the national level. It takes time for it to get through the process. Next slide, please. The class. Traditional philately includes all aspects of philately. There's an old adage that says, if it doesn't fit in any other class, it's a traditional exhibit. Pre-production material is acceptable in the class. It includes other appropriate material for the class, and we'll talk about that. Usages, cancellations, postal rates, and routes. Here, again, there is a warning. In a traditional exhibit, the material has to be treated as traditional. It is not a postal history exhibit. So one should make sure that one is describing their covers, that they talk about the stamp first before they talk about the postal history aspects of the cover. It is, in general, at an international exhibition, a fair balance between a traditional exhibit is 70% stamps and a maximum of 30% covers for an 8-frame exhibit. This is extremely important because more and more the judges are looking for, and the commission is looking for stamps in your exhibit, not 7 frames of postal history. If the exhibit doesn't fit in another class, it is judged as traditional. So for example, if you submit a first day cover exhibit, there is no class at the moment. I would suggest that you treat it as traditional by starting with the stamps and the pre-production material of the stamp or the issue that you are going to be doing in first day covers. However, if you don't treat it that way, and it is difficult to treat the covers because you're dealing with cachets and things like that, it's very difficult to do everything in a traditional manner. And so likely, if you don't build up your exhibit as in a traditional fashion, you will get much lower points in treatment. Next, please. The composition of an exhibit, the material that you can include in the exhibit is archival material and pre-production material, original drawings, essays, adopted or rejected, die and plate proofs, color trial proofs, plate flaws, errors in production, postage stamps, mint, unused or used, and usages. Again, I warn you that the usages must talk about the stamp first. So for example, if you have a number of, if you have a stamp that exists in several shades and they are approved shades, then it is incumbent upon you to talk about the shade of the stamp that's on the cover before you talk about postal history. Postal stationery can be used in a traditional exhibit only if the indicia is the same as the stamps series that you're talking about. And we'll see an example of that in the next slide. You can use local stamps, private delivery stamps, parcel post, carrier stamps. You can also do studies of watermarks and gums and perforations and paper and color. It is very rare to be able to treat an exhibit by any of those later types. But you can, there are possibilities. If it is in support of the story and the treatment and the development of your exhibit, you can use perfins, which they're called perfins in North America and spiffs in England, postal labels, registration labels. You can also do a traditional study of postal labels and registration labels. You can use fiscals, used or unused, when they were valid for postal use, and not in other cases. Postal forgeries are acceptable if they're used in comparison with the genuine stamps. Next slide, please. This is an example of how you can use postal stationery in a traditional exhibit. Only if the vignette is the same. As you can see on the cover, the bottom cover, bottom postal stationery item, there is an additional stamp of that series to and shows that the vignette is the same. It is generally people will use postal stationery in a traditional exhibit if they are unable to get to 8 frames with just the stamps of that series. This example, this sheet comes from an exhibit by Jean-Jacques Siard on the type groupe de Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, and he was unable to move that exhibit past 5 frames if he did not use postal stationery. So he has 1 frame of postal stationery at the end of the exhibit, and this gives me the opportunity to also mention that for those of you who don't know, Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon is a very small French possession at the south of Newfoundland, and it has 6,000 members. It has it has a population of 6,000 people. It has a stamp club with 60 members, 6 of whom exhibit internationally. It is fascinating to see how much philately has grown in those islands in the last few years. And they get good results. So a small entity can get good results. It is risky to use postal stationery because many of the international judges don't like it. But if you have a solid title page and a solid plan, solid synopsis explaining why you're doing it, you should be okay. Next slide, please. Other traditional types of exhibits, collections showing the development stamps, studies on essays and proofs. You can do an exhibit just on essays and proofs. You can do an exhibit just on papers, perforations, watermarks, gums. I mentioned earlier that it is difficult to do that, but I recently judged a show in the United States where one exhibitor did exactly that. He happened to have a series of Mexican stamps that were could be treated by different watermarks, and it was very impressive the way it was done, and it allowed for a different treatment, a different approach to, and an original approach to an exhibit. You can do plate reconstructions, development of plate flaws or re-entries. You can do special studies on letter seals, censor labels, newspaper labels. Again, these are, they have to be treated traditionally and not in a postal history approach. So if you're doing a censor label exhibit of the labels, the censoring labels of Ireland, for example, in the Second World War, you can do a very traditional approach because there are 9 different types, there are different colors, there are different printing fonts, And in all of that, you don't even have to deal with the postal history. Now, censor labels are not usually available in mint or unused condition. So all of the study would be on covers, but again, it's being able to talk about the traditional aspect. Omnibus issues, joint issues, Christmas mail, and in the definition of Christmas mail, one has to make sure that, again, we're talking about traditional approach. You can do, for example, a study of all the Christmas stamps issued by a country, or joint issues is another approach to looking at how different countries work together to put a stamp issue together. I'm also warning you that these traditional studies should be postal and not Cinderella's. Next. One frame. The new rules for one frame exhibits were, again, those rules were accepted at Jakarta in 2022. And they should be implemented somewhere around 2024, 2025. The guidelines are available on the FIP website, and again, I encourage you to look at them. You can do a one frame exhibit from all the types of material we talked about earlier. But you have to have a very narrow subject and scope. The title is of extreme importance, and the scope and the content of the exhibit should be expressed in the title. A selection of items from multi-frame exhibit is acceptable only if they're being treated as a natural sub-theme of the exhibit. If you remove a 1 cent stamp from an 8 stamp series, which was once part of a multi-frame exhibit, you need to treat the 1 cent as an individual exhibit, and therefore you need to talk about the pre-production material. You need to develop the story of the 1 cent, and you need to go beyond what you talked about in your multi-frame exhibit. So, for example, you could do a study of the reentries and the changes that might have been brought to the design over the years of printing. You also should use only the best items of a multi-frame exhibit. Sorry, you cannot use only the best items of a multi-frame exhibit, or cherry picking. It's not an appropriate one frame exhibit because you cannot treat it in one frame, you cannot develop the story in one frame, and certainly your title is not going to be appropriate. I'll give you an example of title and scope. You could, if you want to do an exhibit, a one frame exhibit on the castles of Europe, that is not an appropriate title and it's not an appropriate scope. If you say, well, I'm going to limit my scope to the castles of England or Great Britain, that's still not an appropriate scope. Well, okay, then I'll do the castles of Wales. And believe it or not, that's not an appropriate scope either, because there are 600 castles in Wales. Not all of them are in postal material, but still there are 600. So you need to take those 600 and figure out what scope you can put to a one-frame exhibit. So there were castles built after the Norman conquest, and that would be a natural scope for the castles of Wales. There are about 10 of those. So you could get a one-frame exhibit that is narrow enough to talk about castles of Wales after the Norman conquest. But again, you need to specify the scope and therefore put in the dates of those castles. Next, please. The judging criteria are basically the same in every class. 5 points for presentation, 30 points for treatment and philatelic importance. Knowledge, personal study and research, 35 points. Condition and rarity, 30 points for a total of 100%. As you notice, presentation is in my list as being first. In the FIP guidelines, it's always last. There is more and more of a trend for judging presentation first in an exhibition, and to make sure that those points are locked in and not used to balance at the end of the exhibit, of the judging process. Next slide, please. What we look for in presentation is the material, and is it displayed at its best potential? Is there balance in a sheet, a frame, and the whole exhibit? You'll frequently see jurors, if there's enough room in the aisle, backing up and looking at the whole of your 5-frame or 8-frame exhibit from a distance to have a look at balance, basically, and generally how it looks. Make sure that we look for good usage in the page, not too much white space, variation in mounting. Your write-up is clear, concise, and relevant to the material and the subject. There has to be sufficient write-up, but not too much text. That's a little difficult for some people because we have a tendency to write in a literate format as we're writing a letter. In an exhibit, one should take the opportunity to use boxes, to use tables, to describe rates, for example, or calculation of rates if you're doing that is required in your traditional exhibit. But again, one has to really find a way of writing enough and not too much. Your illustrations, if you're using illustrations, should be originals at the FIP level anyway, and they should not be dominating your exhibit. Your scans, photocopies should be clear, readable, and they must add to the story that you're telling. It's no use giving me scans that are not going to add, and they're just there for balance on a page, or they're just there for displaying a cancel. Unless the cancel is important to the traditional aspect, then there is no need to show me a scan of the cancel. Don't forget that scans or photocopies have to have a minimum difference of 25% from the original. Next, please. General treatment comments before I get into specific ones. You have to have a logical storyline created with your text and material. you have to have a logical plan throughout the exhibit. You should have a golden thread in your headers. It should be like a map. I can go to any page and see where I'm at in your total exhibit, and on that page, what material will I find there? Usages are a secondary part of the exhibit and not the dominant part. There is a tendency on the part of exhibitors to put the usages at the end of the exhibit. One of the things that would benefit an exhibitor is to look at his usage and see if the stamp has a variety or something different than the original, which would allow it to be better placed with the variety. So if you're describing your varieties in frame 2, then that cover with the same variety that you're describing should be in frame 2 and not in the usages. Usages are basically, why was the stamp issued and why is it being used on this particular cover? But finding a variety on cover is usually more valuable when it comes to rarity points. You can plan your exhibit chronologically by printing, geographically. Mexican districts are a perfect example of that, or by modes of transportation, so railway mail. The FIPTR guidelines at the moment, the new ones, do not mention catalog treatment. This has been the overwhelming approach in the past and still in large measure is currently followed by exhibitors. That's basically taking a catalog, whatever it is, specialized or not, and mounting your exhibit based on catalog numbers. It may not be the best way of doing it, and the traditional commission is really encouraging people to get away from that approach. Sometimes it's not feasible, sometimes the only approach, but in many other cases, there are different approaches. Again, there's anyway, treating the exhibit generally, it can be any way the exhibitor feels appropriate. We talked about watermarks and papers, for example. Next, please. Treatment includes your page, your introductory page or title page. You need to have a short, precise title, normally showing the scope, and a secondary or subtitle is acceptable. So basically what we're saying is try to find a short enough title to express what's in your exhibit and put some dates to it so that we can have a scope and we know what we're looking at. Make sure you define your exhibit properly. For example, some of the issues around the world have the same name, but are from different countries. So the Admirals of Rhodesia or the Admirals of Canada, if you're going to give me a title, the Admirals, well, I would like to know what country I'm going to be looking at before I even come to the exhibition so that I can prepare myself. I believe it or not, one exhibitor managed to not even mention the country by name on his or her title page. And so by the time you got to the exhibit, you had to get to the exhibition to know what the country he or she were talking about. You need to have a description of the purpose and the scope of the exhibit. And in North America, we tell exhibitors, the first thing you should do in your exhibit is to start with the sentence, the purpose of this exhibit is to. Until you get used to describing purpose and scope, that is a good approach to use, and you see it frequently in international exhibitions now. A short plan. This is a traditional exhibit. It's not a thematic exhibit. We don't need a long plan. We don't need a broken down plan. We need a plan that will give us some guide marks as to what the chapters are in your exhibit. Again, sometimes because of the nature of the traditional exhibit and the stamp series, that's not necessarily as indicative as of what we're going to see as other series. So if you're doing a catalog, for example, having chapters saying 1 cent, 1 centime, 2 centime, 3 centime, 5 centime, 10 centime, and so forth is not a good plan for a traditional exhibit. In fact, you wouldn't need a plan in a case like that because you're doing a catalog approach. A list of the exhibitor's personal research on the subject and reference to it in the literature. You need to tell the judge that you've written and researched about it and where the judge can find the information that you wrote, the article that you wrote or the book that you wrote. A good bibliography reference for that is important. And a list of the most important literature available on the subject that you're talking about. It's useless to put references to general catalogs, obscure and out-of-date articles and periodicals, and general websites such as Wikipedia should be avoided. There are a number of many Wikipedia entries that have errors of information in it. You can use them for general purposes, but it is important that you do your caveat emptor and you do your due diligence before you use the information. So double check the information. Next slide, please. This is an example of a Canadian small queen exhibit. And this series was issued from 1870 to 1897 and was used in millions and billions, particularly the 3 cent. It has been displayed for years on a catalog basis. The catalog approach to this series is nonsensical, but that's how it's being done. And if you look at the catalog breakdown of this series, it is evident that it was done by dealers who did not, over the years, want to change and adapt the information into a new structure. This exhibit, or these pages from this exhibit, are there for 2 reasons. One, you can see on the display that the exhibitor has broken down the structure of the exhibit in a different fashion. So he has 1870 to 1873, which is the first Ottawa printing. And then he has 1873 to 1888, which is the Montreal printing. And then he has 1888 to 1897, which was the second Ottawa printing. The printing company is the same, except it had a fire in Montreal and had to go back to Ottawa to do the third group of stamps. As you can see, there are also different values in each of the series that do not exist in each of the printings. For example, the half cent never appeared until 1882. And what the exhibitor is doing here is he's showing you at the top of each page the papers and gums and And then he shows the different stamps by the different printings for each of the different printing presses, or the different printing offices. What this also does is it gives you an idea of how your headers should be in an exhibit. So each of his chapters starts with this kind of page, and then the word introduction. And then he goes on to work on each value of each value of these stamps in the different venue of the printing. And so it makes a very different approach. It is one that the commission has really liked, and it was used by the commission in its deliberations for an approach to a new approach to putting traditional exhibits together. This exhibitor, called Guillaume Vadmoncar, was doing this exhibit as a catalog exhibit, and he won the Grand Prix National at the youth exhibition in Montreal in 1992. This version of his exhibit got him a gold medal in London 2022. So he's still at it. Next, please. Synopsis, or synthèse. Basically is a new concept. Well, it's not that new, but it's still a new concept for most individuals. At the international level, it cannot be more than 2 pages. At the national level, it really depends on the country. In the US and Canada, for example, it could be up to 4 pages. This document is for the judges only. It does not appear in your exhibit. What you need to do in there is to put anything that you need to convince the judges on how you meet the criteria. So it is good to break down the criteria in your synopsis and explain how you feel you've met the requirements for each of those criteria individually. You need to give historical background and statistics, or this is the place you can do this. Too many exhibitors provide historical background in their title page and miss the opportunity to really put the information on title page that is important about the exhibit and not about the different wars or the different economic conditions. It's the same thing with statistics. There's a difficulty sometimes to express those statistics in the exhibit, and one needs to be able to do so to make sure that the judge understands where you're getting at. An example of that is the use of English or British stamps in Ireland in the 19th century. One exhibitor, to do that, it's a traditional exhibit, and to do that, you have to have all the stamps used in Ireland. Otherwise, you wouldn't know if they originated in Ireland or not, which is a different approach to start with. And then it is a question of explaining how difficult it is to acquire the different stamps and all the plate numbers in Ireland, and were they in fact sent to Ireland. But importantly as well is, and this is where the exhibitor went from a lower medal level to a higher one, by giving statistics showing that there was a decrease in population, a decrease in literate population, and a decrease in the use of males in the 19th century. So that made finding some of these stamps extremely difficult, and added to giving him credit. The statistics gave him credit for rarity later on. It also gives you the opportunity to give additional references that you didn't have room to do on the title page. Again, I warn you that some judges dislike references on the title pages. So I still encourage you to put a small number of them on, particularly if they're your own writings, but put the remainder of them in the synopsis. QR codes. I know you talked about this in the fossil history presentation that was given to you a month or so ago, or whenever it was, I'm not sure anymore. There is no problem using QR codes in the synopsis and on the title page. They don't need to be the same link. The title page should be the two things. It should be the ability for the viewer, not the judges, to get more information on what you're trying to show. And for the judges in a synopsis, the QR code could be the same, or you can add another one that would direct the judge to your exhibit. If your exhibit has been scanned and put into one of these exhibit websites. QR code helps to also reduce the amount of text you can write, or you should write, or shouldn't write. Next, please. Treatment for 20 points. How do we evaluate treatment? So part of that 20 points includes how well the title page meets the criteria that we mentioned about in previous slides. How the subject chosen is appropriately balanced in the space that's available. So 5 frames and 8 frames and 1 framers do not have the same real estate, do not have the same number of pages, and they cannot be developed the same way, and they cannot be treated the same way. So one has to keep in mind that one moves from 5 frames to 8 frames. It's not a question of, it is not just a question of adding material. It is a question of looking at how to treat and develop an 8-frame exhibit versus a 5-frame exhibit. And you would be surprised how important that is to get higher level medals. The people who get a large resume with 5 frames and move on to 8 frames at the next exhibition, in most cases will likely maintain their large resume with lower points, or could even lose a medal level because they haven't taken the time to redo the exhibit for a development in 8 frames. I encourage you, if you're going to go to 5 to 8 frames, that you don't rush to do it. In fact, the FIP gives you the possibility of not doing that for 2 years. After that, you must go to 8 frames. So it will allow you as well to to find new material if you don't have enough for 8 frames, to also find new material that is not duplication of what you have in your 5 frames. Duplication is also a real problem for people who go from 5 to 8 frames. The content of your material reflects the title, the purpose, the scope, and the plan. There's no material there that doesn't belong. Your primary focus, your important focus, is on the stamps. It's always about the stamps, not about anything else, not about the cancel, not about the postal history. It's about the stamps first. You can have a section on cancels, you can have a section on usages, but you must talk about the stamps first. Completeness in relation to your scope is one of the areas that we look at for treatment. In other words, have you been able to cover your scope and show a good representation of all the elements that should be seen in that scope. There are areas where it is difficult, but if you find it difficult, you need to explain why it is difficult in your title page or your synopsis. Headers support the plan and the material on the page. Headers are becoming a very, very important way of putting a traditional or any exhibit together so that we, the judges and the viewers, can walk through your exhibit and know where you are at any given time. And it is also important that the right-hand side, or whatever way you do it, at the top, explain basically what the material is on the page and how it relates to the total chapter. You have to have a natural start and ending point of the exhibit. In traditional, it's pretty easy when you're doing a series of stamps to start at a specific time when the first stamp of that series is issued and when the last stamp is issued. There are traditional exhibits when you're talking about a series of stamps that are more, that you have some flexibility as to what you can put into the exhibit. And we will talk about that when we talk about how one looks at putting a modern traditional exhibit together later on in this presentation. Do not duplicate the material. Text should explain the reason for showing it. If I go back to the small queen exhibit, the 3 cent was used for first-class mail and domestic first-class mail in Canada for 15 or 20 years. And at the same time, it was also the rate to the United States for another 10 to 12 years. The 3 cent is the most common stamp in the whole series. And therefore, as we will talk about later, you don't need to emphasize the common stuff. So if you're talking about usages of the 3 cent stamp, find a nice domestic cover or a cover to the US. You don't need to show both. What you need to do is in your text say that the same rate applied to the US or to domestic letters. So you don't need to show me 2 common 3 cents covers because you're explaining the usage for those 2 points. Next, please. Continued treatment, the selection of the material that you show is a compromise between what the exhibitor has and the number of frames allotted. It is important to make sure that you select the best material to tell your story. You should not put in your exhibit a cover just because you like it, because it's your favorite, or because you paid a lot of money for it. If it is not part of demonstrating what the exhibit is all about and the story is all about, then it should stay at home. So we also Selection of material is an important factor in evaluating treatment, but it also is an important factor in talking about knowledge, which we will talk about in a few minutes. It's sometimes difficult for judges to separate the two. The selection of material in treatment is about basically is the material you selected appropriate for telling the story. And we'll talk about the knowledge part later. The exhibitor, as we said with the 3-cent small queen, for example, you could omit material of less significance. Basically, what is called the token showing. You don't need to show everything. While the better material of the same issue should be shown in depth. Usually those are the higher values. Next, please. Importance. Importance has always been a very difficult element to judge. And also it is one of the most criticized criteria on from exhibitors. So right now, importance is relative to the significance of the actual exhibit and the overall significance of the subject chosen. How difficult is the selected area that you chose to collect and to exhibit? How important or significant is the material shown relative to this selected area? Significance of the selected area versus the philately of the whole country. Sometimes you can find a subject that, or an area that is limited, but also has an impact on the philately of the whole country. Again, the significance of the selected area that is exhibited versus the world philately. With all due respect to the Vatican, the airmails of the Vatican are not important. They don't even have an airport. And but there are people who collect them, and there are people who show exhibits of the airmails of the Vatican. There is a new approach to judging importance, and it's gaining popularity, and that is the 5 and 5 breakdown. Basically, we divide the 10 points into 5 and 5, and 5 is for the significance of the exhibit, and 5 is for significance of the subject. In the past, it was too easy to give 10 points for importance to the first issues of any country. It was a little more difficult when it came to Germany and Italy and South Africa, and to a certain extent Canada, where there were provinces or states. And is Sardinia more important than Sicily? Is the Cape of Good Hope more important than Transvaal? Is New Brunswick more important than Canada? Those were elements that one had to be very careful about when one judged importance. But in general, the first issues of most countries got 10 points. Now it is becoming less common for exhibits to get 10 points, because yes, the first issues of a country will likely get 5 points for the significance of the subject. But if your exhibit is not a good one, if it's not treated properly, if it doesn't have a lot of the rarities, then it certainly will not receive a 5 for the significance of the exhibit, which will mean that you may or may not get 2 points, 3 points, and you'll get 7 or 8. What this is doing is making sure that there is a balance, a better balance for importance, and that is in large measure because people were getting upset at how importance was being judged. And we'll talk about a bit about that when we talk about modern approaches to traditional. What the result is now is that there are fewer high and low scores in importance. It doesn't mean you can't get a 5, and it doesn't mean you can't get a 10, but there are far fewer of those than there used to be. I also would like to warn you that the 5 and 5 is not universally accepted by judges, by national federations, but it's gaining ground. And it's becoming more popular at the international level as well. Next, please. Philatelic research, philatelic and related knowledge, part of the total 35 points. The choice of items reflects the knowledge of the chosen areas. This is where we talked about selection earlier. So your choice of these items has to be related to the knowledge that you have of the area that you're exhibiting. You need to make sure that your items are accurately and well described. The existing literature within the area has been used and discussed if warranted. Discussed if warranted basically means that if you disagree with or have a change to make to what the existing literature says, then you need to express it in the exhibit at the item you're talking about. Handbooks that were published earlier and could, because there's nothing else available, could still be the more important literature that is used by judges to prepare for the exhibit, may say, like one does, that the largest multiple of a particular stamp in existence is a block of 12. And that block of 12 in later years was broken down, sorry, a block of 16. That in later years, that block of 16 was broken down into 4 blocks of 4. The exhibitor was able to find that information and write down in his exhibit that the block of 4 that he was displaying was part of the block of 16, and that the block of 16 had been broken down. So that means that the judge who's expecting to see the block of 16 is not going to see it, and now knows why he or she is not going to see it. Your personal, your research and your new discoveries should be given full coverage. It is important that if you have made a new discovery, you say so under your item. You have to demonstrate a full and accurate understanding of the subject chosen. It's difficult sometimes, but what we're looking for is to make sure that you have looked and express and demonstrate that you know your subject basically inside out. And there is, although this is not this is not a rarity item. One has to make sure that, and this is where it relates to philatelic knowledge, that you don't use the words unique and very rare. These do not mean anything in an exhibit. And if you're using rarity factors, then you have to tell the judges where those rarity factors come from, and who created them, and what the structure of those rarity factors are. Next, please. Personal studies and research, the other part of the 35 points. We need to know, you to know, and you need to demonstrate that the process of the preparation of the series or the stamps is shown by pre-production material. Try to define the types, the printings, the plating issues, and define them properly on your stamps and with issue dates and numbers printed if you can find that information and where you found it. Back to the Small Queen exhibit of Guillaume Vadeboncoeur, that information is all available as to how many stamps were issued for what printing. And it is important to be able to do that because it gives you extra, or to demonstrate that because it gives you additional knowledge points, research points. We're looking for your treating of the guns, the papers, the watermarks, the perforations, and that they're properly described. Why is the stamp issued? Was it a makeup rate, a stamp for a makeup rate? Was it a stamp issued for domestic rate? Was it a stamp issued for international rate? Was it a stamp issued for airmail rate? Those are all things that you need to express in your traditional exhibit. Again, I keep on telling you that the proper and correct choice of usages, and that you describe them in a traditional way, which means, again, you must talk about the stamp first. We judged all of that, this slide and the previous slide, on how you describe and evaluate each of the philatelic items shown. We're not necessarily going to look at each of the items, but in general, an exhibitor tends to approach the evaluation and description of the philatelic items in generally a uniform fashion. Next, condition. 10 points. Well, one of the easy ones to get 10 points for basically is get the best possible condition, period, amen. Modern material has to be impeccable. It has to be properly centered, all the perforations. The material should be free of stains and dirt. Hopefully no missing perforations. On an imperforate stamp or material, it should have all its margins. Nice and clear cancellations, even if it's not a Marco-Fili exhibit, we're looking for clear cancellations. Judges will generally forgive condition issues for unique and rare items. So I know I say we don't use the word unique and rare on the description on a page of an exhibit, but we can use unique or rare for material that we're talking about as in the condition, and we commonly use that in the language. If your item that you're showing, even if it's unique or rare or not, if it's been restored or manipulated, you need to describe what has happened to the item. If margins have been added, if that kind of thing, or perforations added. First of all, in normal circumstances, you shouldn't show that. But again, when we get back to the rarity of, or uniqueness, then many exhibitors will find a way of mentioning the existence of it and not show it. Or if they show it, they are very, very careful to explain why they're showing it and why it has been modified. Next, please. Rarity, 20 points. What we're looking for is the scarcity of the material, not its value. I know for some of you that doesn't ring true, and but it is in fact what we're supposed to be looking at, the scarcity of the material, not its value. Sometimes they go together, but in other cases, demand of certain items will make it valuable, but not really scarce. The inverted jenny of the United States, for example, is a good example. In a good condition, it goes anywhere between 800 to $1 million US. There are 96 of them. It's not rare, but it's valuable because there's a demand for it. It's an iconic stamp for the Americans, and there are a lot of them who want it. How difficult is it to obtain the relevant or interesting material that you have in the exhibit? You have to be able to express that and tell us in your exhibit how much time it took you to find the stuff. We don't need it for everything. We need it for material that you know, for example, an example of description could include for an item that it is the only copy the exhibitor has seen in 20 years or in 30 years. That's part of one of the many ways of doing a description of or quantifying a rarity. How difficult is it to duplicate the exhibit? That is sometimes that's something we need to look at as a judge, but it's sometimes difficult to say. And it's not a major factor that I use anyway, because sometimes I don't know how difficult it is to replicate. Many exhibitors in North America tend to put that information in their synopsis. So it really is, I mean, if I'm looking at your exhibit and you have 20 of the top rarities of the traditional subject that you're showing, but yes, then I will know that it's difficult to replicate because none of that material is available elsewhere, or they're in very small quantities. You should describe the earliest known usages or even the last known usage, large blocks recorded, small printing volumes, special varieties. In your usages, you can talk about scarce postmarks, markings, mixed frankings, rates, routes, and destinations, but again, it's not as important in a traditional exhibit as it would be in a postal history exhibit. But what it does show is that you have material that is difficult to acquire in another class, but it also shows your knowledge of the rarity of the item that you're showing. Errors in paper, watermarks, perforations, all form part of giving you the rarity points. You should avoid philatelically produced material and too much printer's waste. That is an example of that is the first Czech issues, which have a lot of printer's waste. And so the best exhibit, although may use some of it, is the one that uses the least possible amount of it, only the material it needs to tell the story. Your rarity statements must be up to date and accurately described. So there are many ways of expressing rarity statements. You can do it in by using italics or bold, or you can have a small star or a small indication that this item needs to be looked at. And you also, some people also mount it in a different colored mount, but they must be accurately described, and they must really represent the rarity that they are. And you need to constantly review auction catalogs and other material and other publications and periodicals to keep up to date, to see if an item has been, other copies of the material has been found, and you need to redescribe the rarity factor. I've got two examples for you on that. One is the rarest stamp in Canada is a 2-cent large queen on laid paper. Its rarity is based on the fact that it's on paper, just as much as a different paper, just as much as the Z-Grill in the United States is on paper. It doesn't make for great visual rarities. Anyway, the 1-cent, the 2-cent large queen on laid paper, the last copy of it had been found in 1930. There were only two for all those years. And in 2005, a third one was found. So the exhibitor that had one of those copies in his large queen collection had to change from one of 2 known to one of 3 known. So you have to look at it from a position that your exhibit is always growing. It has to change. It cannot be shown over and over and over again with the same information, because information does change. New books are published, and you need to be able to look at all of that. And I know I told you I was going to mention a second example, but now it escapes my mind. And so I will, if I remember, I'll get back to it. Those are the criteria for judging exhibits at the traditional class, at international level, and in many countries who use the FIP criteria for judging at the national level. There are very few countries that do not use the FIP as guidelines to judge. Although virtually every country in the world uses the 8 medal level, we in North America do not use the FIP guidelines for judging. We have our own, and they don't necessarily match. So some exhibitors at the national level who qualify to go to the FIP international sometimes get a shock and of how much work they have to do to change their exhibits to show it internationally. Next, please. One of the things that I find interesting, and I was basically talking earlier before this session started, that at the international level for Italy, we basically see more than 90% of the exhibits we see are Italian states, also history and traditional. We very rarely see any other exhibition or exhibit of Italy or Italian colonies, or there was, Aniello mentioned San Marino, the Vatican, there's Trieste, and there's a number of other areas in the Italian world that we very rarely see. Now, I understand that an exhibit on the Vatican, a traditional exhibit on the Vatican would not get good results because of the nature of the materials. But it doesn't mean that there aren't, that that you cannot do a national level exhibit on the subject. The other area that I'm particularly fond of, and I'm trying to push people to consider, and that is putting an exhibit of post-World War II material in exhibition, both at the national level or the international level. And you can get good results with modern exhibits. You have to be very selective as to what you're going to show to get those good results. You have to avoid commemoratives. They really don't have enough material to do a treatment or a development in more than one frame. So if you're trying to get a 5-frame or 8-frame out of commemoratives, you're not going to get very far. What you should do is concentrate on definitives. The kind of stamps and series that were basically issued in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. Most post offices in that period were trying all kinds of new approaches to save costs, find new ways of getting the mail to your inbox, to your post box faster. They were experimenting with papers, perforations, tagging, fluorescence. They were changing printers, and they had a rapid rate of changing the tariffs and the rates that they charged for the different services that they offered. So it makes for a lot of varieties, and it allows you to put together an exhibit that can meet all of the criteria of a traditional exhibit at a very high level. Again, it's much more difficult because you have to really concentrate on using a definitive series that can give you as much free leeway and as much possibilities to tell the story. The other thing that it gives you the opportunity is that they are unresearched, And so there's a lot of potential for you to do original research and to find new discoveries. You also must think out of the box. You must really be creative, innovative, and look at the big picture rather than the traditional way of doing things with other earlier traditional exhibit. An example of that, next slide, please. An example of that is the Machins. As most people know what the Machins are. British from the 1970s to 2022. And I get the impression that the next series, King Charles III, is going to be very similar in look. There are thousands of stamps of this issue. There is no way you can do a you would need 100 frames to do a full display of the Machins from 1970 on to 2022. Steve McGill, an American, has received a number of large gold medals doing exhibits on the Machins and national grand awards. But what he does is he concentrates on certain aspects of the series and uses technology as the basis for most of them. So he will do an exhibit, for example, on the use of fluorescence, or he will do an exhibit on the security measures. And he will limit his exhibits sometimes to a scope that is not the full 52 years of the series, but rather the scope of when those security issues were treated, or when the fluorescence appeared, or different types of fluorescence. And so there is potential for very high rewards and original research for modern philately. If we take, if we look at Italy, next slide, please. There are a number of series that I looked at, and I'm not an expert, so I want to make sure that one understands that there is potential here for good results. Internationally, I don't know because I'm not as knowledgeable as you are on those series, but I looked at the Siracusana, the San Giorgio, and the Alti Valori of 1953 to 1979. And they have a huge number of areas that can be covered in a multi-frame exhibit of a traditional exhibit, such as different watermarks, different sizes, different printing methods. Perforations are different. Some of the designs have been redrawn. Fluorescence has been added to some of them. There are booklets, there are forgeries, and there are varieties, and there are Trieste overprints for the Siracusana. This is where I would keep in mind that you can think out of the box, because if you look at the Alti Valori, they were issued well beyond 1979. And but they were also, that part of them was when you changed over from the lira to the euro. And that is possibly, you can, if you really want to, you could integrate them into this particular group because they're basically the same image. It's up to you to define the scope that you want to cover? Next slide, please. I also looked at the Castelli and the Lavoro. I don't find as much in the Lavoro to make it a possibility because I don't know it that much. Unless it has a large number of varieties, it really does not have, to my knowledge anyway, it doesn't have enough of a scope to do an exhibit. The Castelli, again, have a number of varieties: watermarks, printing methods, size, coils, booklets, varieties. Again, I don't know how vast that scope is and what's available, but you can also be out of the box with the Castellis because they are covering during the Castelli the use of the high values on the previous slide were ongoing. So you can take the high values from that and move them with the Castelli. It just, you need to be able to structure a plan and a scope and a description that will fit best the material you have and the story you want to tell, and to ensure how you can balance the exhibit and ensure that you can get rarities that will help enhance the value, the rarity value on the rarity points of your exhibit. In conclusion, I really, based on what I understood from Aniello, I really think, and I encourage you to start a traditional exhibit. It doesn't seem that there are a great number of them. I would like to see them outside the box of the traditional Italian states, so that you can show that there are other things in Italy beyond the Italian states. I don't know if there's enough material to put an exhibit on Trieste, for example, or there certainly should be enough material to do an Italian Ethiopia. Ethiopia for many years was a possession or a colony of Italy. I would need to, or you would need to, look at the potential for San Marino. It started issuing stamps in 1877, but don't forget that for 30 years before that, it used Italian stamps, and just as much as Great Britain used in Ireland. Is it? I'm questioning because I don't know. Is it possible to get Italian states used in San Marino identified as being used in San Marino? And that could be part of the whole of an exhibit on San Marino. Anyway, I do encourage you to exhibit traditional and to find ways of improving the number of exhibits, and to really concentrate on new and different approaches. All right, thank you. Grazie.
Thank you, Charles. Much appreciated. I think people participating to this seminar have acquired much information to go towards new exhibits, sorry. And I encourage them, as you told, and also like Aniello, to choose modern topics, modern definite issues, and develop exhibits that are able to obtain achieve good results even at international exhibitions. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Apriamo il dibattito, allora potete o alzare la mano oppure scrivere la domanda in chat.
Yes,
Bruno?
so thank you Charles, merci bien pour ta participation. E come avete visto, come avevamo detto, il confronto internazionale è sempre molto utile. Mi permetto di sottolineare un punto, uno fra i tanti che Charles ha toccato, e cioè quello della sinossi per i giurati. La sinossi per i giurati dice massimo 2 pagine, io vi consiglio una, perché così siamo abbastanza sicuri che il giurato la legga, e questa non è il foglio di presentazione, non è rivolta al pubblico, è rivolta esclusivamente ai giurati, quindi è un documento tecnico. Non dovete spiegare che cosa sono i castelli, lo sanno. Dovete spiegare quali sono le novità, quali sono gli interessi, quali sono i punti di rispondenza, come ci ha detto, tra ciò che vuole il regolamento e ciò che avete fatto. L'idea del QR code è un'idea importante e vincente, e quindi usufruiamo di queste nuove tecnologie e soprattutto adattiamoci al contesto. Una cosa è il foglio di presentazione che si rivolge ai collezionisti e una cosa è la presentazione che si rivolge alla giuria. I documenti vanno preparati in modo diverso. Adesso lascio al dibattito, vi ringrazio. Io complimenti a Luca, ad Aniello e a Charles che hanno organizzato il PowerPoint. Fra 8 minuti vi saluto perché alle 5 ho un altro meeting Zoom per tutt'altro argomento. Nel frattempo vi ascolto fino a quel momento. Prego.
Paolo, hai alzato la mano? Prego.
Salut Charles, bonjour. Thanks a lot for your presentation. I was intrigued by your remark about the 70% and 30% proportion between stamps and usages. So if I go through or I try to develop this, you would suggest to avoid presenting in traditional series of stamps where, for instance, due to lack of varieties and preparatory material, it's very, very difficult to reach this proportion? Or what to do in such a case? How to explain to the judges the situation?
My view is that you choose what you want to exhibit. It is your exhibit, and you show it the way you wish to show it. Okay. Mm-hmm. If you want to play, like going to the Olympic Games, I guess, is if you want to play, but you have to play by the rules. And that's where selecting the subject becomes an important factor, because how do you look at, you know, is there enough material to do 5 frames? Is there enough material to do 8 frames? You have to start with 5. Just after that, doesn't matter. If you don't have 8, it's up to you to select the subject. Coming back to the 70-30, it's a rule of thumb, basically, that no more, maximum should be 30% usages. But we don't count. so it's flexible. Unless you put all your usages at the end and you have 4 frames of usages and 4 frames of traditional, then it's 50-50. And then that's when there's an imbalance of what is supposed to be a traditional exhibit. Because most people will talk about the postal history in the usages, and they won't talk about the stamp. And it's a traditional exhibit, so that's why we recommend strongly that you move your covers that have varieties or errors or can fit in the traditional part, because they will count as traditional. They will not count as usages. And so that's where the balance becomes a little more flexible.
Thanks a lot.
Martino Laurenzi.
Grazie, Luca. First of all, I'd like to thank Charles for his presentation, which is really, really great and interesting. And I almost made me regret for having abandoned the field of traditional philately to go to postal history, Charles, because actually I've had bad experiences, and I'm delighted that you gave this presentation to this team today, because I think it's very important for people, for the judges to be educated, even more than us, because when you are exhibiting a subject, you really are the expert, and sometimes you find that there's no correspondence of experience on the other side, on the judge. So what happened to me, I just can give you a quick example of why I sold my collection, which was seahorses, overprinted seahorses, the high value of King George V. And you know, I never was able to go above the level of large vermeil, for the simple reason that importance was always considered very low. And the reason for that, I can understand, is that, you know, this is overprinted material. It's 5 countries that are not really important in the world. But at the same time, you know, when I hear you saying that countries like, for example, like Saint-Pierre and Miquelon will get the good rating, I'm surprised. Maybe I've attended the wrong meetings, because, you know, again, given the importance of such a small country, it must not be considered that big, that relevant. Well, it was clearly an issue with my presentation, my exhibit. So having said all that, you know, for example, just give you a quick example here. Once I got a comment from a judge that I didn't have the overprinted pound. The pound was never overprinted. The green pound value was never overprinted. So again, I think that it's important that the judges are also educated. And at the same time, I am kind of moved to postal history, where, you know, you get more out of less, if you know what I mean. And then also there is an important aspect to it, being that you know, it's less constrictive and less you know, there's, when you spoke about the catalog classification, for example, I also have a comment on that. You know, you need to have a guide for the colors, for the shades, for the rarity of the material. And you know, for example, Nauru, I don't know if you're familiar with this particular series set.
Martino.
But, you see,
Yeah, okay.
It's only that, you know, there's a stamp there that it was printed in 60 examples, and that's way less than the genuine. So in other words, I'm delighted that I think that the focus should be more, or at least more, on educating the judges, as much as educating the people, which I really am grateful for you having done that. I'm sorry if it took too long.
I entirely agree with you about the judges being educated. It is difficult. It's a difficult to do. Judges need to take a seminar before they're accredited, in addition to their apprenticeship. Mm-hmm. But there really is nothing after that for them to be brought up to standards of new guidelines and things like that. The FIT has a jury academy where it is offering a course, a 3-day course to all judges. It's a generic course. It is not specialized on any of the classes, although it covers a number of classes, and the exercises, judging of the frames, include traditional postal history, traditional one-framers, sometimes youth, sometimes postcards. But it isn't specifically for a class. So it is a generic look at the criteria. In the question of Saint Pierre Miquelon, the exhibitor has really never gotten that high points in importance. His first issue, not the one I showed, but his first issue does get 8s. But in his case, what has happened is he gets large gold medals simply because he's got perfect points in rarity and condition, in research and knowledge, and in treatment. And that's what makes him, that's how he's able to get 96. It is not the importance, because you're right, the Saint Pierre Miquelon is not, not a big important philatelic area. I really don't want or can't comment on the seahorses because A, I haven't seen it. B, it is an area that is where the importance lies in the seahorses is not the fact that they're not important because they are the high values. I think what it is it's just one element of the period of definitive issues. And I think it's hard to really describe the importance of the seahorses without seeing the exhibit, simply because in addition to that, it's not only the seahorses of Great Britain, but they were overprinted for Ireland and they were overprinted for Morocco and they may be overprinted for elsewhere, but I really don't know. So it's pretty hard to say. But again, it's the scope, and we need to, anyway, I would need to see it. But yeah, I agree about the judging, and yes, it definitely has to be, when there are new guidelines issued, somehow a new course should be developed by the commission and offered. But the commission, the FIP it's hard to change things at the FIP in a quick fashion. And sometimes it doesn't even cross their minds that they could do these seminars in a virtual fashion, so that the judges don't have to be at a FIP show to take the seminar.
No, thank you very much, Charles. I don't want to take time from others to comment. I just want to let me add the fact here that judges should also all be. I heard you saying a lot of times that this is not done in the U.S. or done differently in different countries. This should not be. This should always be the same, and not wonder whether your luck we're going to bring you to a good expert or to a person who's only half an expert, or a person who judges your collection on different standards than what you're used to. That's it. Sorry, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Altre domande? Mi sembra che in chat non ve ne siano altre. Bene, se non vi sono altri interventi, ringrazio tutti voi per la presenza oggi. Ricordo agli espositori che sono in corso due esposizioni, una è latina, le domande di iscrizione scadono domenica prossima, 2 aprile, è riservata alle collezioni Un quadro di tutte le classi e alle partecipazioni di filatelia d'oggi, cioè le collezioni costruite con materiale prevalentemente successivo al 1990. L'altra esposizione invece è virtuale, Filitalia 4.0, riservata a gran parte delle classi di qualificazione, non per un quadro. Quindi invito tutti quanti volessero approcciare nuove collezioni, anche nuove classi che magari non hanno mai frequentato, a iscriversi anche a Filitalia. Ringrazio i due relatori. Aniello, grazie.
Grazie a te, Luca.
And Charles, thank you very much again.
You're welcome.
Your time, your help are very appreciated. Thank you very much. I hope to see you very soon in some exhibitions around the world.
I'll be at Ibra.
Ah, okay, okay. So
All right,
maybe.
thank you very much for inviting me, and I really enjoyed doing this.
Thank you again. Grazie a tutti voi e a presto per altri seminari della Federazione relativi a argomenti sulle classi espositive. A presto, arrivederci a tutti. Buona domenica.
Grazie a tutti, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao a tutti.